"You don't look like you belong here, unless you're here to wipe the chairs. Paper doesn't change the color of your skin." Right there in the courtroom, where justice was supposed to mean something, a white cop spat those words straight into the face of a black woman with all the contempt of someone who thought the badge made him untouchable. But this time, he picked the wrong target, and that smug flick of the hand, it was paid back just minutes later with a hit that dropped him harder than any gavel ever could. What happens when the silent one finally throws a punch? Have you ever seen justice begin not from the law, but from the blow that broke the silence? Watch until the end and see how the whole system got knocked down. From the moment the courtroom door creaked open, Brent McRae's eyes locked onto the woman walking in, one step at a time, as if each movement offended the warped pride he wore like armor. She wore a white shirt, black slacks, low shoes, her hair neatly braided and pulled close to her head. But to him, that tidiness looked like arrogance, something he couldn't tolerate. He blocked her path outright, hand resting on the belt where his gun hung loose, eyes scanning her clothes from collar to shoes, stopping exactly where he meant to strike, her skin. "You don't look like you belong here, unless you're here to wipe the chairs." His voice was low and flat, like a line rehearsed all morning, saved just for the first person who gave him reason to humiliate. A clerk started to step forward to tell him to move, but after making eye contact with McRae, he stepped back, nodded slightly, and pretended nothing had happened. She didn't lower her head. She didn't look away. Instead, she handed him a folded paper, its crease perfectly straight. An official summons signed by a federal judge is date-stamped. McRae didn't bother reading it. He waved his hand, almost slapping the paper away. "Paper doesn't change the color of your skin," he said it slowly, loud enough for someone 10 feet away to hear clearly. A young female officer checking the scanner looked up, hesitated, then glanced back down like she was inspecting a circuit. Everything in the hallway turned mute, like an old play everyone had seen too often to care about anymore. She returned the paper to her pocket without a word. Her eyes didn't shift, fixed right between McRae's eyebrows. For a few seconds he seemed irritated by the silence. To someone like him, silence from a black person wasn't politeness, it was defiance. "Do you hear me? I said you don't belong here." He leaned on the word belong, like he was teaching a slow child. A few people in the waiting seats began glancing over but kept their heads down, pretending to scroll on their phones. An elderly woman flipped her notebook, hands trembling, eyes on the metal cuffs swaying from McRae's hip. Some had seen him use them more like a club than a restraint. She stepped half a foot to the right, trying to move past. McRae matched the motion, blocking her like a shadow with no manners. The entire hallway shrank to just the two of them. 10 seconds passed in a silent standoff. The vein in his neck started to pulse. She didn't move again. She knew he was testing limits, but she also knew when he tried this with other people of color, it rarely stopped at mockery. He would shove, he would drag, and if someone resisted, he'd shout, "Assaulting an officer." Any footage would blur beneath a few internal reports and a staged apology. But today, his target wasn't like the others. What he didn't know was that this woman hadn't come begging for a seat. She'd been summoned, and she carried something not written on that summons, the training of someone who knew which limits were real and which were just traps dressed as rules. He lowered his voice, hissing just loud enough for her to hear, "You think wearing a white shirt gives you the right to walk in here like a lawyer? Another overconfident black type. You know how long that kind lasts?" There was no reply. Just a fact. That day, McRae was the last one who got to choose how he left that hallway, upright or broken, and he chose wrong. A young staffer by the metal detector held his clipboard with shaky hands as he watched. The white shirt she wore had become the subject of judgment, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was on a body with the wrong skin. The boy stepped forward, not daring to meet McRae's gaze, and said just loud enough, "She's a special witness, summoned by..." McRae abruptly turned around before the sentence was even finished. His eyes widened with fury, his breath hot and laced with the stench of tobacco as it hit the staff member's face. "You're calling this one a witness?" His voice wasn't loud, but it struck straight at the instinct to obey in those beneath him. The staffer froze. The word sorry stuck in his throat. Everyone else in the hallway either turned away or fixated on their phone screens. They had all learned a lesson early on in public service. Never place yourself between a cop and his victim, especially when that victim doesn't share your skin. She remained still. Her eyes didn't flick sideways, nor did she look at the staffer. But in her mind, his face was already recorded. Trim haircut, slender frame, worn-down black shoes, a slight hunch whenever he spoke. She wasn't angry with him, but she would not forget. She walked straight past McCrae as if he were just a boulder to maneuver around, not a man to engage, even when he lingered half a step closer, his hand tightening slightly around the belt where his Glock rested safely holstered. She did not break stride. He meant to stop her again, but the gaze of a passing judge made him freeze. His power stretched far within the hallway, but it never exceeded the wooden bench where that man sat. Upon entering the courtroom, she glanced around. Heavy dark green curtains lined both walls. The jury section cordoned off by pale wooden rails, the desks aligned in precise spacing down to the inch. The witness chair stood in the center, exposed to the entire room. It was the spot people were called to, interrogated and clarified, then quietly dismissed. She had known that from her first day of training. A courtroom is never neutral. It is built to expose, to control, and to break. She didn't scan the room to take in details. She scanned to remember. Every pair of eyes watching her carried a trace. The sneer of an old lawyer with a shiny gold watch, the eye roll of a young female officer, the blank indifference of a clerk taking notes. She didn't need their names. Their expressions told her enough. Who would stay silent if she were dragged from her seat, who would write a falsified report, and who would claim I couldn't see clearly when the audio went mute on the video. The sign that read, "Silence is respect," posted on the wooden wall behind the judge, made her pause for a beat, not because she agreed, but because it captured the truth of this room better than any slogan she had ever seen. Here, silence was not a mark of respect, it was complicity. McCrae remained outside, but his shadow clung to her thoughts. The way he spoke, interrupted, filled space. It was the behavior of someone taught to believe his presence was the only standard that mattered. He didn't need a reason to despise her, because the system had already taught him this. Skin color is reason enough. As she sat in the witness chair, her hand touched the edge of the wooden rail, fingertips tapping in quiet rhythm. From afar, McCrae entered and chose a seat along the aisle, close enough to insert himself into anything if he pleased. He leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, but his eyes never left her. She didn't need to look. She knew men like him. They never watched out of curiosity. They watched to check if what they considered beneath them dared to lift its head. And in that moment she exhaled a deep breath, because from now on, everything that happened in this room would be recorded in her memory, to reclaim every shred of dignity stripped away, every insult shoved down her throat, every condescending glance they believed would fade like dust. She knew this with certainty. This time, nothing would fade. McCrae walked into the courtroom with the swagger of someone who had been patted on the back too many times by his superiors for effective control. He held a thick stack of unbound files, letting the pages slap against each other as he passed the row of seats. A dry, sharp sound meant to assert silent authority. He didn't look directly at anyone, but he knew his presence always drew eyes. Some averted, some avoided, and a few familiar faces gave a small nod, like they feared accidentally offending a uniformed power. He stopped at the center of the room, cleared his throat, and read, louder than necessary, "Black, female, civilian, unknown employment history." The line seemed neutral, but each word was deliberate. He breezed through the first three like a tag, then paused coldly before the remaining four. One juror glanced up, frowned, but said nothing. No one corrected the wording or addressed his tone. Those things had long since folded into the rhythm of daily procedure. McCrae folded the file, kept it in his hand rather than returning it to the table. He stepped closer to the woman seated at the witness stand, his expression half mocking, half probing, his lip curled, not from humor. It was the smirk of a man who believed he could extract facts with a stare before forcing someone to say them aloud. "Which district are you from?" he asked, then turned to the clerk before waiting for an answer. "I need it for the civil verification section." A few seconds passed with no reply, so he turned fully toward her, slowing his speech like a lesson for a child. "Ah, right. Poor districts rarely have proper records." The words fell like a stone onto frozen water. No echo, but heavy enough to sting anyone who'd lived in places labeled poor. In a system where insults came wrapped in job titles, people had learned to pretend nothing was heard. She didn't move, not out of compliance, but because nothing he said was unfamiliar. Every sentence revealed more of a system that allowed such comments without consequence. His words didn't bring new wounds. They were stale winds she had trained herself to ignore. McCrae turned again, pacing the room like a man patrolling a compound. He wasn't done. He leaned toward one of the internal camera monitors, then abruptly called out, "Have you held any legal employment before being summoned here?" Some lifted their heads. A few assumed he meant work history. Others understood the subtext, that a woman without listed credentials was presumed unworthy of respect. She adjusted her collar slightly, not from offense, but to keep her body temperature from following her emotions. Her old training had taught her rage narrows focus. When surrounded by rotten language, wrapped in legality, let the anger sit low and wait. McCrae returned to the main table and tossed the file down like a used rag. He glanced at the judge, then back at her, as if the roll call needed one last bit of theater. "Is there a number we can call for verification? Or do people like you just make things up and disappear after court?" The question required no answer. It was never meant for one. But by existing, it left an invisible cut across the map of dignity inside the room. And under the sterile glow of courtroom lights, the most honest thing in sight wasn't a file or a badge. McCrae attempted to erase someone's name with nothing but repeated, calculated words. She sat still, silent, but her gaze had long left McCrae. She no longer looked at him. Her eyes were on the high ceiling, where lights were designed to cast no shadows. Because of that, everything lay bare, just like the room's true nature. McCrae took a seat near the Internal Affairs desk, resting his arm as if he ran the hearing. He glanced over some harmless papers while scanning the room, his smirk signaling each new way to twist the atmosphere into a stage for calculated disgrace. She sat upright in the bright light, hands on her lap, eyes on the witness desk edge. She knew she was the center of the room. No one told her how to act. She was summoned to testify, yet any statement she brought was stripped away the moment she walked in. What remained was the label others gave her, an unknown black woman wrapped in formalities designed to excuse contempt. She stayed silent, like someone crossing a minefield. Every line McCrae threw, every glance, every indifferent gesture from court staff was a half-pulled pin, not detonated but allowed, not hidden but displayed under lights meant to symbolize justice. The collapse wasn't sudden, it was staged, from the drawn-out roll call to questions posed with no answers expected. All of it aimed to reduce her to a symbol of failure and disposability. And the audience wasn't outsiders, it was the courtroom itself. Some pretended to write, some stared at their phones, some gave her pitying looks before turning away. A few chuckled at McCrae's jab about a poor district with no files. They were there, but absent. All played roles in a silent play where the humiliated lead had no voice. No one questioned McCrae. No one stopped him from speaking about a witness's identity before the court. No one admitted they were used to black bodies being default targets in trials claiming fairness. She glanced at the jury. An older woman in red velvet watched her with uneasy eyes and a faint shake of the head. Maybe sympathy, maybe anger, but too soft to act. In their silence, acceptance was rationalized. They were not cruel, just conflict-averse. In here, conscience folded like the files before them. McCrae needed nothing more. He knew that when the room tilted just right, the victim shrank by design. His footsteps, his presence, his backslaps all weighed more than her words. And that was the image he painted. She knew if she spoke, her words would be twisted, filtered by bias, no longer testimony but reaction. And a black person's reaction in court is always recorded as a threat, so she stayed still. Silence here was a decision, a way to record each face, each act, not on tape, but in flesh. Each move McCrae made added proof, and while the court thought it was hearing a case, she was memorizing a new indictment, not for the judge, but for the moment when those above would be forced to look up. McCrae slowed his steps as he approached, the sharp tap of his polished shoes against the cold stone floor echoing like a warning. The air in the courtroom, already thick with half-cautious, half-gleeful glances, was now overtaken by his domineering presence. He didn't shout or make noise, but the way he leaned in, stooping low beside her, turned a simple movement into a human-shaped threat. "Have you ever heard gunfire? Or are you just good at keeping your mouth shut to stay alive?" His voice was hoarse, sticky with the scent of stale cigarettes and cold food clinging to each word like cheap glue. His breath hit the back of her neck, not loud, just close enough to make each syllable a thorn digging into skin. He didn't care what her answer was. He asked to sink her. It was a form of domination that left no fingerprints, but pressed hard enough to crush the throat of anyone born without the skin tone he deemed acceptable. She kept her eyes forward. It wasn't defiance, but a trained tactic. Keep the airway clear. Don't let anger clog the mind. She knew the tone of someone who rose by drowning others. He wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last, as long as this system kept opening its doors to men like him. Behind her, another officer whispered to McCrae, voice buried beneath rustling papers and the hum of the air vent. Was she forced to come here? The final two words were accented like an inside joke, a brand of laughter reserved for those who knew the rules well enough to trample them with ease. Both men chuckled, like they'd shared a filthy secret only they understood. Not loud, but just enough for the clerk nearby to hear and turn away with a visible frown. In a room bearing the name of justice, that laugh, ironically, sounded like the most honest noise. McCrae stood upright, adjusted his belt, and ran a coarse hand down his face. He had said what needed saying, not to threaten, but to establish rank. In his world, where every action came wrapped in the word procedure, humiliating a witness was simply the prelude to shaping the narrative. If she felt fear, he won. If she reacted, he still won, so long as he twisted that reaction into instability. It was all rehearsed, repeated across countless scenarios he had imagined and controlled to the end. He turned toward the judge, nodded in a wordless request, then stepped back to his place. The motion was crisp, effortless, like completing a bureaucratic form. She didn't turn her head. She recorded each step, each smile, each sound, every detail filed away like a living archive. It wouldn't appear in official reports, wouldn't be logged in transcripts, but when the moment came, it would surface, unstoppable. The fluorescent lights above cast an even, cold glow that left no corner in shadow. Yet in all that brightness, each person found their way to hide, some behind their titles, others in silence, and a few beneath half-hearted nods. McCrae chose to stand directly in the light because he knew no one would ask why he was there. She lifted her chin slightly, adjusted her collar, not for composure but to stay balanced on this invisible battleground. Here, language wasn't used for communication, it was used for control, and men like McCrae wielded it to build walls between us and them. But she understood one thing well: any wall built from humiliation ends up imprisoning its builder too. The room settled again, as if nothing had happened, but someone had caught her eye. A young staffer by the door looked away, his smile gone for the first time that morning, not because of McCrae, but because that look made him realize something was forming. Not a reaction, but a response. A small note floated through the air, brushed a white sleeve, then fell onto the smooth floor. The sound was faint but clear, exaggerated by silence stretched too long. One guard pretended to look elsewhere. Another bent to tie an imaginary shoelace. She bent down, unfolded the note without flinching. Blue pen, male handwriting, rough and rushed. Go back to the jungle. The word jungle was smudged, but the intent was sharp. No symbol, no name, not a joke, but a belief. She folded it again, placed it on the desk, hands were loose, but her gaze had shifted, no longer calm or detached, not angry either, just final, as if something inside had shut. McCrae glanced over. He didn't ask. His face relaxed slightly, satisfied by the silence he believed he had engineered. For him, harm lay not in the insult, but in making someone feel surrounded and unable to name the enemy. A woman in the third row frowned, then looked into her bag, not from curiosity, but habit. The habit of someone who'd seen injustice before and still didn't know how to respond. At an age where peace feels easier than truth, she chose to stay still. The note wasn't meant to be seen, only to linger. Its power lay in collective silence. No one had to defend it. If no one spoke, it was legitimized. A black person rising to ask who threw that could be branded disruptive. She knew the rule and refused to play by theirs. But what changed the room wasn't the note. It was her look when she raised her eyes again, no longer waiting, guarded. It was direct, and it made others look inward. McCrae leaned back, but didn't stop watching. He searched for something, a flicker, a crack. But what he saw was silence. Firm and unshaken. She never spoke of the note, yet it stayed on the table, between her documents, like a quiet charge. It wasn't recorded, not part of the transcript, but it shaped every breath she took, every word she chose. From that moment, she wasn't just testifying for a case, she was testifying to the system that let the note exist, that allowed it to spread and vanish as if it had never happened. And when the hearing ended, everyone else could walk away. But she had seen what they refused to face. One day, they would have to explain why they saw it and stayed still. When the questioning ended, the judge allowed a 10-minute recess before the next session. Lawyers began gathering their documents, jurors stood to stretch, and quiet conversations murmured as people moved about. But she stayed seated, not because she wasn't ready to leave the witness stand, but because McCrae was blocking the way out. He said nothing at first. Arms crossed, stance wide enough to block the narrow aisle between the benches in the hallway. From a distance, it might have looked like he was waiting for someone or chatting with a colleague, but his eyes locked on her, sharp and unblinking, like a threat without words. She glanced at her notes, stacked them precisely, and lifted them with the calmness of someone used to scrutiny. As she stood, McCrae stepped forward, slow, deliberate, cutting her path. His eyes flicked to her hand, like even lifting a paper required his approval. "You haven't been dismissed. Sit back down." The room froze again. The clerk, mid-sentence, looked up, then quickly lowered his head and scribbled nonsense. A younger officer took a hesitant step forward, but stopped as soon as McCrae's glare landed on him. She said nothing. Her breath remained steady, eyes locked on his, posture unchanged. She didn't retreat, didn't speak, didn't comply. In that suspended silence, the space between them drew taut, as if held together by wire. McCrae stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but the air between them shrank, thick with sweat and the sterile sting of disinfectant on his uniform. The room didn't have walls between them, but he tried to create one. Why imposing a permission he thought only he could give? "Everyone else is on break," he said, eyes pinned to hers. "But not you. We have more to verify." "Who's we?" she asked, voice even, each word weighted. He smirked. "You know who." A man 2 rows back cleared his throat, not loud enough to be a protest, but enough to be heard. McCrae didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew that here he could speak on behalf of authority, and no one would interrupt unless someone higher said to. That someone wasn't present today, or chose not to be. She stepped back half a pace, gaze fixed. "How long are you planning to keep me here?" "Until I'm done," he said with a sneer. "Or until you learn to wait." Her eyes shifted, not to him but to the gallery, where a brown-skinned student stared back. He didn't look away. He didn't lower his head. For the first time that morning, someone watched without pretending not to see. That was all she needed. She wouldn't retreat, wouldn't exit quietly, wouldn't wait for him to leave. If he planned to stand there forever, then she would stand longer. Not to provoke, but to prove a point, What he was blocking wasn't just a woman trying to leave. It was the last breath of silence he thought he still owned. She spoke softly, each word placed with intent. "I don't need your permission to stand here or to move." Her words were not a provocation, nor a show of defiance. They were a plain statement in a normal world. If the man across from her hadn't been McCrae, and the room not built from layers of authority embedded in subtle acts. She spoke slowly, just loud enough for him to hear, just firm enough to make others nearby pause their page-turning and keystrokes. McCrae tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes, as if weighing whether to smile. But he didn't. He stepped closer and pressed his right hand heavily onto her left shoulder, not like someone offering a reminder to stay seated, but with force, enough to mark the gesture as a message. "You need this in here." His voice was low, rough, and cold. His hand bore down as if to press her into the place he believed she belonged. From the jury box, an older man glanced over, then quickly looked left, as if he'd misseen something best forgotten. She didn't sit immediately. Training made her shoulder tense for a brief second, but she didn't flinch. She breathed slowly, eyes fixed forward, as if his gesture were just a misplaced motion in a massive machine. His pressure was clear, but the only one who thought he was in control was he. He released his grip with one final push, stood up straight, and stepped aside. Smirking, he expected her to recoil or retreat, but she stayed still, expression unchanged. The folder before her remained neat, the pen beside it unmoved, as if nothing had disturbed the air. His actions were no accident. They were part of a practiced pattern. A tap on the shoulder, a joking elbow, a lingering glance, all shielded by phrases like processing error, emotional lapse, or no intent to harm. She knew this well. Her shoulder could still strike back. Her hands could subdue someone like him in 2 seconds. But not today. A reaction now would draw every gaze to her, and the only recorded act would be the motion of her shoulder, not the hand that pushed. A young clerk to her left had seen everything, from McCrae's approach to his touch and withdrawal, but wrote nothing. His pen hovered over the timestamp box, unmoving. He didn't want to be the first to document an act without instruction. In this system, those who write the truth are erased before the ink dries. McCrae turned away, waved lightly to a colleague by the door, grinning in shared understanding. He believed what he did was standard, correct, and necessary, that a black woman sitting too upright in court posed more of a threat than a point of view. She sat down slowly. Not because of his words, but because it was time to keep watching. His moves didn't weaken her, they sharpened the picture. In her mind, the pieces clicked into place. His stare, the rustle of paper, the quiet phrase, the pressure that pinned memory into stone. She didn't write it down. She stored it where no one could alter the words, and that gave her a calm deeper than any rage. McCrae's hand pressed down hard on her left shoulder, unprovoked, unapologetic, and without fear of consequence. His grip sank deeper than necessary, thumbnail biting into fabric, thumb jamming into muscle, as if testing whether beneath her skin was bone or something lesser, something he believed to be beneath him. He leaned in so close their cheeks nearly met. "I've hit stray dogs harder than that." The words came out in a rough, gravelly voice, from a throat practiced in contempt. His tongue rolled each syllable slowly, savoring every image built from verbal violence. He wasn't trying to hide anything, not the insult, not the threat. He didn't need to. In this place, what he did would go unchecked, unrecorded, and uninterrupted. He spoke freely, knowing the silence of the system would carry the burden of his words. His breath hit her face, thick with stale smoke and the sharp burn of something chemical like leaked gas. But worse than the smell was what lingered beneath it, the stench of entitlement left too long unwashed, legitimized filth that had spread like habit, stained like something no soap could remove and no one cared to. She didn't pull away. Her head stayed upright, her face unmoved. The only shift was in her breathing, adjusted to keep her airway open despite the toxic air before her. She didn't meet his gaze, not because she feared it, but because his eyes no longer offered any insight. They were walls now, dirty ones, plastered with slogans learned during years of being coddled by a system that never questioned men like him. He held his stance one beat too long, then shoved down once more before straightening. No words followed, no apology. What he left behind wasn't a bruise, but a jolt. One that snapped the room back into a reality uglier than any transcript could capture. A woman, seated in what should be the safest space in the building, was reduced to something less than human by someone who wore the badge of law. No one stepped in. No one said, "Stop." A stenographer paused barely 3 seconds, then resumed typing as if nothing had happened. A security guard glanced over, then returned his eyes to the digital schedule on the wall. A lawyer paused mid-sec, but instead of intervening, quietly set his papers down and took his seat, eyes avoiding hers. These were trained reactions. See, understand, retreat. She stayed seated, spine held firm as it had been since she entered. The pain in her shoulder wasn't from McCrae's force. It came from the confirmation that, even with sunlight flooding every corner, this place still nourished darkness, a darkness that spoke, that crossed physical boundaries without leaving marks and without consequence. She drew a long breath, steadying her lungs against the reflex to recoil. Her right hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table, not to strike, but to anchor herself to the only thing that remained solid in the room. Everything else had started to warp under the weight of distorted authority. McCrae walked back to his seat, shoulders squared, his posture twitching with self-satisfaction. In his mind, she was just a witness. But in doing what he did, he had unknowingly signed his name on an indictment not yet written, an indictment that required no courtroom, no judge, no jury, just the memory of the person he tried to break, and patience long enough to wait for the right moment. She watched him without a word, her gaze closing another chapter, not one about injustice, but the first chapter of reckoning, not aimed at a person, but at a language that had existed too long without being answered. A man in the second row, middle-aged and dressed in a light brown suit, shifted forward when McCrae forced her shoulder down. It wasn't impulse, but the instinct of someone who had seen something so wrong it pulled the body out of stillness. His hand touched the back of the seat ahead, lips parting slightly, about to speak. But McCrae turned, raising a handcuff from his belt with practiced ease, and held it in front of the man. "Sit down, this isn't your business." The words didn't need volume. No shouting, no commotion, just enough force to freeze any intention forming in the man's mind. He halted, body stiff, his back still half bent. His eyes widened, not from fear of the cuff, but from the raw truth that struck him. In a room called a courtroom, McCrae could raise a cuff at anyone not fitting the expected role. He held it mid-air like a small emblem of sanctioned power, a warning about timely silence, about the line between having a conscience and keeping a position. He didn't need to strike. One raised hand, and the whole room knew who could speak and who had to swallow it. The man sat. His shoulders sank, as if under the weight no one asked him to bear. He no longer looked at McCrae, nor dared meet her eyes. He stared at his knees, as though reviewing reasons to justify doing nothing. He might go home and convince himself that his silence today was to keep his seat tomorrow. He might try to make up for it with an anonymous post or a quiet conversation. But in that moment, everything was clear. When power raised the cuff, principle sat down. McCrae holstered the cuff and turned as if completing a routine. He didn't glance at the man. To him, that hesitation was expected, living proof of the system he represented, a system that knew the weak points in the collective conscience and used them to preserve false order. She didn't need to watch it unfold. Every movement McCrae made had been registered through a different sense, one that recorded details without sound or grand gestures. But something else had begun within her. In her mind, a scene from the field returned, like a sealed tape suddenly replaying. A dusty corridor, distant blasts, right hand clutching a weapon, left fingers curled joint by joint ready to strike if surrounded. The drills had never been theoretical. They were designed to embed themselves into muscle so the body would remember when the mind was overwhelmed. And now, in the sterile courtroom under white lights, her left hand began to tighten. A small motion barely visible, but for anyone trained in real combat, It was a signal. His index pressed into the palm, thumb locked to the middle finger's edge, wrist taut, elbow aligned on a diagonal. All eyes still lingered on McCrae or darted away, but anyone who'd served with her would know that arm wasn't trembling. It was being prepared. She stared at McCrae's back. No anger, no regret, just the look of someone stepping beyond the point of no return. Every insult, every shove, every cuff threat had crossed the final line. McCrae's shoes hit the floor harder than usual as he returned, as if suddenly realizing the game he started was slipping out of his control. The words, the shoulder grab, the asserting stare, none of it had satisfied the instinct that had grown unchecked within him after years in uniform. He needed a final blow, something to re-establish the power now slipping from his hands. Without warning, he closed in, seized her wrist, and yanked her violently from her. Pens and papers were scattered on the floor, and the sharp clang of her metal watch hitting the edge of the table cut through the air like a warning shot before the storm. She staggered for a second, but didn't fall. Muscle memory held her upright, even as her shoulder tore against the motion. "Well, get up, or should I carry you?" His voice was low and taunting, meant to wound more than provoke, drawn from the mouth of someone who had long controlled others through force and arrogance. Everyone in the courtroom heard him clearly, though no one would admit the words had crossed the line. A lawyer on the opposite side flinched, but didn't move, his hand frozen on an open file. They all saw it, yet none stood, knowing that in this kind of game the first to step forward was the first to lose control. McCrae tightened his grip, nails digging into her wrist like punctuation in a sentence written in pressure instead of ink. "People like you survive on pity." He hurled the words like a slap, a hit he believed would leave a deeper mark than a punch. To him, pity was something black people never deserved unless they bowed, smiled weakly, and expressed gratitude for being spared. The woman in front of him didn't fit that mold, and that made her dangerous. She turned to face him, her eyes neither angry nor pleading. They were sharp, clean, like a syringe sliding beneath skin without warning. McCrae paused. For a moment the grip around her wrist loosened, and in that hesitation, everything on his face betrayed the power gray he'd crafted so carefully. The court clerk began to rise, but a glance from a security officer froze her mid-motion. Everyone knew what they should do. No one wanted to go first. The silence thickened, pressing down like a lid over boiling water, one twitch away from exploding. She pulled her hand back, slowly, firmly. Her wrist slipped from his grip like cold water from a cracked glass. And when she did, her eyes were no longer guarded. They were measuring distance. McCrae stepped slightly back, just a fraction, but enough. Enough for someone trained in movement to know that the threat had registered. It wasn't action yet, but it was in the frame of vision, in the tension of her shoulders, in the way her left hand remained down while her thumb quietly locked into a combat-ready position. He said nothing more, turned away, clicked his tongue like a man disappointed the show didn't go his way. But he knew, and so did she, that the wire he pulled had reached its end. What he'd grabbed was not a witness, not a black woman he could dismiss. What he'd tried to drag from that chair was someone who knew the rules, knew how to push back, and who had run out of patience for giving anyone else the benefit of the doubt. She bent to pick up the fallen note, folded it as before, and returned to her spot, standing tall. No one asked anything further. But from that moment on, no one dared touch her again. Those who rely on force understand one thing well. Silence can be a response, but also the final pause before a strike that needs no warning. She stood upright, shoulders steady after McCrae's forced grip, eyes locked on him. There was no fear, no burst of rage, only clarity, the kind that slices clean like a blade unsheathed. Nothing left to avoid, no reason to hold back. "You've got the wrong script." Her voice was calm, each word delivered with measured precision, like a line rehearsed in truth. McCrae blinked, not out of surprise, but the instinct of someone who just realized he no longer held the upper hand. In his mind, she had entered the room as something small, a witness, a number, a file lost in protocol. But with a single sentence, that definition unraveled. He smirked, his upper lip curling into a sneer, not confidence but habit, a dangerous one. Masking threat with mockery, he stepped closer, shrinking the distance, trying to reclaim control. That was the last move he owned. As his foot landed, her eyes narrowed, shoulders dropped, and torso rotated. The shift was instant, not noticeable in real time, only felt like a tight ripple breaking loose. A staffer by the door let out a choked sound as McCrae stumbled. The strike came without warning, without a change in tone. It was not a defensive move, it was execution, honed to neutralize danger without hesitation. McCrae fell back, feet slipping, knees buckling on instinct. He tilted toward the table, arms flailing for support. Nothing caught him. His back hit the edge, his chin tapped the wood. Then he slid fully to the floor. The impact cracked through the room like a signal no one expected. Heads lifted. Pens dropped. No one reached out to retrieve them. The typist stood halfway, frozen above the keys. An older lawyer's hand stopped mid-air, glass trembling between his fingers. The silence wasn't a surprise. It was shock, the kind born from something long assumed impossible, or, more precisely, from something no one dared do. She didn't move again. She stood firm, feet planted, arms relaxed, eyes cast down at the body now collapsed in front of her. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't displayed, it was a consequence built from every act tolerated, ignored, and pushed past the line. McCrae lay there, gasping, eyes wide, not in pain but in disbelief. He had ruled rooms like this for years. Silenced witnesses, blocked the weak mid-trial without resistance. He assumed this would be no different. He hadn't prepared for the person across from him to know exactly how to respond, with shoulder control, wrist alignment, and precision. Beneath him was a system struck at its pressure point, the one it thought no one could read. And now, every person present had to ask themselves, since when did self-defense in a courtroom become something that left a room this stunned? Her turn was neither flashy nor telegraphed by a loud breath or wide stance. It unfolded like a reflex etched deep into her muscle memory. With half a pivot, her body shifted from defensive to offensive. Anyone trained in tactical combat would recognize it instantly. A classic maneuver, no wasted motion, no repeated steps, no openings exposed. McCrae didn't have time to retreat. He stood too close, lips curling into a smug half-smile, but before his brain could fire a signal to raise his arms in defense, her open palm struck his neck in a slicing motion. It wasn't a punch, it was a precision chop aimed directly at his windpipe, a strike designed to interrupt breath and nerve signals. His throat went silent, like someone had shut off the air valve with a ruthless flick. In less than half a second, her left elbow drove into the side of his torso. Not a heavy blow, but it landed right between his ribs and intercostal muscles, precisely where pain reflex bends any human body. His breath snapped, legs faltered, and what had been stable footing turned soft beneath him. He stumbled backward, not by choice, but from the force of recoil. His back slammed into the edge of the table, harder this time, and the thud rang out like a warning shot to the entire room. A security guard in the corner shifted half a step, hand on his radio but not yet activating it. The court clerk dropped her pen for the second time during the session. All eyes turned toward the center of the courtroom, once considered neutral ground, now the site of an unexpected rupture. She remained where she had struck, her feet angled slightly, weight forward, arms at her sides, but wrists tensed and ready to reset the strike if needed. Every signal from her body spoke fluently in the language of defiance. Don't touch me, don't command me, and don't think fear will make me comply. McCrae clutched his throat and coughed once, trying to reclaim his voice, but all that emerged was ragged breath and clenched teeth behind pale lips. He was no longer smirking. The smirk, the stance of dominance, all had collapsed within 2 seconds. On his face now was not simple rage, but a tangled shame, an animal stunned by the realization that the prey had claws. In a room where no one was ever expected to stand, eyes began shifting. People started glancing at one another. Whispers rose. Those who had previously avoided her gaze now lifted their heads. not to help, but to witness, because what was happening had broken out of procedure, beyond the bounds of anything a court transcript could conceal. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her actions were a statement enough. This wasn't a panicked outburst. It was a planned response, timed precisely, and executed without hesitation. A physical verdict against those who abused power, thinking no one would strike back. McCrae stepped back again, his eyes scanning the room, as if looking for a foothold. But in that instant, he finally faced what years of unchecked control had never taught him. Not everyone stays silent, and not everyone needs permission to stand. Those who used to sneer, those who rolled their eyes as he humiliated her, those who believed their uniforms put them above reproach, all now watched his badge spinning on the floor. And they understood it wasn't just metal falling, it was the emblem of a system stripped bare. Up in the right-hand corner of the courtroom was a security camera. No one had noticed it before, having grown used to it as background administrative decor. But now its lens remained fixed on the heart of the room, where McCrae had fallen. The small green light blinked steadily, a signal that every moment, every word, every movement, and every strike had been recorded in full. Heavy breathing rose from all sides, not just from McCrae struggling to get up, but from those watching. A female intern in the back row curled into herself, hand covering her mouth, eyes wide, not from shock, but because, for the first time in her life, she had seen someone in a courtroom stand up against blatant abuse of power. The guard by the door took a step, then stopped. His foot froze between two rows of seats, his gaze shifting from her, the one who had startled the system, to McCrae, the man he had always been told, leave alone, he knows too much. No one had taught them how to respond to something like this. She stayed where she was, head slightly tilted, as if waiting to see if anyone dared to step forward and say what was right. But no one did. The room was filled only with silence. Silence so sharp that even the smallest sound felt like a blade slicing air. The badge had stopped rolling, now resting by the leg of a chair. No one picked it up. McCrae looked up from the floor, his eyes bloodshot with both rage and fear. He still hadn't spoken. His lips moved faintly, breath short and broken, like a man fleeing the nightmare he created. He hadn't fallen because of a punch. He had fallen because he couldn't believe someone no longer feared him. She no longer looked at him. Her gaze was not for individuals now. It moved across the room, from the prosecution to the defense tables, from court staff to the stenographer, like a question unspoken. Who will keep sitting now? Every construct of that courtroom, the protocol, the transcripts, the formalities, had torn at that moment, and McCrae's collapse was not an ending. It was the start. Each frame from every camera, every clip stored on the hard drives, stood as a reminder. Some trials do not end with a gavel. Some falls require no sentence, because the verdict is written in the eyes of those who knew. From that moment on, they could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. A security officer moved quickly from the courtroom entrance, his steps sharp, hand near his belt, eyes locked on the woman standing firm at the center. He needed no order. The situation was clear. A man was down, likely injured, and the closest person wasn't in uniform. Every reaction protocol ingrained in his training pointed to one thing: containment. His hand reached out, about to touch her shoulder, when a voice called out from behind the bench. Firm, composed, more commanding than any siren. Hold it. The entire room froze. She didn't turn, but her shoulders eased slightly. The officer hesitated, then stopped altogether. The speaker was one of the three presiding judges, seated in the center, half-rimmed glasses perched low, who had until then remained silent. But now, his eyes were sharper than anything he had displayed before. "Check her ID," he continued, voice steady but resonant, as though each word had been drawn from an unwritten statute everyone instinctively understood. He wasn't doubting her. He had simply realized that what had just occurred was not a reckless outburst, as some might assume. It ran deeper, and if he misjudged it, The entire system could be swallowed by the very arrogance it had long protected. The officer paused, glancing at the judge, then back at her. No one rushed, no one shouted. This silence no longer carried the weight of complicity. It had become readiness to listen, a shift that, for years, no one had expected in this room, especially not when the voice of authority didn't wear robes or enter from the front. She calmly retrieved something from her inner coat pocket. Not a summons, not a regular ID. A small, square leather wallet opened in one hand, with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. She extended it without a word, her eyes still fixed on those before her. The officer took it, flipped it open, and instantly his expression shifted. His eyebrows rose, his hand stiffened briefly, then he closed the wallet and returned it, untouched. No one needed to hear the name, no one had to read the title. The black badge with embossed lettering and unmistakable insignia said everything. Special Operations Personnel with seal clearance, authorized to conduct independent investigations. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers interlocked. He said nothing more, but his face revealed the shift. She wasn't here just as a witness, and her actions weren't the desperate pushback of a civilian pushed too far. They were intentional, within her mandate, and more importantly, executed by someone who knew exactly where she stood within the system. McCrae still lay on the floor, eyes wide, face flushed deep with rage and humiliation. He had thought she was just a civilian, someone to be brushed aside with words and stares. He hadn't prepared for the truth, that the woman he belittled was one of those with the authority to audit his file, and now, perhaps, had already memorized it. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. No one stood to cheer. But change doesn't need noise to unfold. It only needs a voice at the right time, an ID in the right hand, and one act that leaves the entire system with no path to retreat. A woman had just knocked down a badge with 2 strikes, then rebalanced the scales with a card, not to boast but to remind. The law isn't a tool for the powerful. It's a net wide enough for even the dismissed to finally stand in. The card had barely closed, not yet returned to her pocket, when every eye in the room locked onto the bold words on its front. U.S. Navy SEAL, clearance level 4. 3 short lines, yet the weight of them crushed every excuse lingering in the minds of those who had just laughed, sneered, or sat still as if nothing had happened. From the prosecution bench to the press row, silence fell. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of awakening, the kind that follows a slap not to the face, but straight to awareness. The woman McCrae had just tried to drag from her seat like a disposable pawn was not a civilian, and certainly not black civilian unknown employment history, as he had once read aloud to humiliate her. She was a member of the nation's most elite combat force, someone who once held the authority to make life or death decisions in battle, and now stood here, forced to protect herself from a man wearing the same uniform color. She looked around the room, not with anger, not with disdain, but with a clarity that forced everyone to confront their silence. When she spoke, no one dared look away. I defended this country. Today I have to defend myself from someone wearing their badge. Her voice did not rise like steel. It carried the steady tone of someone who had accepted a painful truth and still refused to step back. Each word cut clean, as if carved by the blade, a truth no one wanted to hear, but no one could deny. In a space meant to represent law and justice, a soldier had just been treated like garbage because of her skin. An aging lawyer put his hand to his forehead, not from fatigue, but shame. The court clerk slowed her typing, head bowed, as if willing her hands to stop trembling. McCrae slumped against the bench, head bowed, eyes down, not from pain, but because he knew he had been stripped bare, not by force, but by an unerasable truth. The card was not shown to intimidate. It was proof, living evidence of a story long buried, that this country's borders were defended by people who, once home, had to defend themselves against abuse by those wearing the same uniform, pledging loyalty to the same flag. And worse still, no one ever thought to speak up until their blood hit the courtroom floor and Justice stayed silent. She did not advance nor step back. She stood still, a pillar in the eye of a moral storm. Her presence, her identity, her status, her brutal calm reduced every title in the room to paper scraps. No one mentioned procedure. No one asked, was this authorized? Because every authorization had just been obliterated by a single sentence. The nature of power without integrity always looks for a way out, but this time it had none. Everyone in that room understood they would not leave unchanged. They had seen someone who once held the front lines with bare hands, insulted in open court, and still standing, as if to say, I don't need permission to defend myself. News began breaking less than 2 hours after the incident. It started with a short post from an anonymous account along with a blurry but unmistakable video. McCrae falling backward, his badge hitting the floor, and a black woman standing tall, her gaze unwavering. The caption was simple: Navy SEAL assaulted mid-trial. Within 30 minutes, the phrase "Black Navy SEAL attacked in court" shot to the top of social media platforms. From that point forward, the narrative slipped from the hands of the courthouse and any internal authority. Major news outlets jumped in, each with a different angle, but all circling the same core. A service member who once protected her country in silence was now humiliated, threatened, and assaulted by someone who claimed to uphold justice. And didn't take long for the press to dig deeper. Once McCrae's identity was confirmed, long-buried files in the system were ripped open. A string of quietly dismissed events surfaced. 5 years ago, he was accused of coercing a teenager during interrogation. The complaint vanished in a week and the boy changed schools. 3 years ago, an internal staff member reported McCrae's use of racial slurs during roll calls. It was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Just last year, a black woman filed a complaint after being dragged from her car during a traffic stop. Mancy Crae's longtime friend signed the witness statement. All these cases had something in common. No one was charged, no one was disciplined, and no one was asked to resign. Protected and still serving, a seasoned journalist wrote in the first editorial on the story. The words were cold, but they struck public consciousness harder than any formal indictment. In less than a day, McCrae transformed from a loud-mouthed officer used to bullying the powerless into a symbol of the rot hidden beneath the badge of law and order. People began asking, how many more McCraes are out there, still untouched? How many complaints were buried because messing with law enforcement is trouble? And if that video didn't exist, if the woman hadn't been a Navy SEAL but just another witness, who would have spoken up? The headlines swelled. On a national news broadcast, the evening segment opened with the chilling question, "She defended our country. Who defends her at home?" Old interviews of McCrae were clipped, compared against the complaint files, and matched line for line with his words in the courtroom video. The way he called her black female civilian, the smug smirk when he spat, or are you only good at staying silent to survive? Those words no longer passed unnoticed. They became evidence. Former defenders of McCrae began quietly retreating. Some ex-colleagues deleted group photos. A legal team, once vocal against internal policing reform, released a statement, "We do not condone violence in any form," but the statement arrived far too late. And her, the woman once dragged like a nameless shadow, had become the center of national reckoning. Not because she screamed or broke down, but because she held her truth without wavering. That truth alone was enough to tilt a system that had long believed itself untouchable. And for the first time in years, the phrase, "real accountability," was uttered in an emergency judicial oversight meeting, not by a victim, but by someone who used to look the other way. The clip surfaced just as public outrage was boiling over. No one knew who leaked it, but only hours after McCrae's name hit the media, the recording spread with alarming speed. It was filmed from a hidden device. Low angle, slightly shaky, but with sound clear enough to catch every word. His voice was unmistakable. The tone, the phrasing, the way he hit the ends of sentences all matched exactly what he'd used in the courtroom the day before. In the clip, he stood beside a patrol car, hand resting on the windshield. In front of him was an elderly woman hunched over, holding a worn fabric grocery bag. The camera was too far to capture her face, but Her voice was clear, trembling, small, painfully polite. She explained she'd been told to exit her car, said she had only gone shopping, and hadn't broken any traffic laws. McRae didn't respond immediately. He stared at her for a long moment, then smirked, spat on the ground, and said just one thing: "Shut your mouth, monkey lady." For a moment, social media froze, as if everything had paused. The phrase wasn't long, and it wasn't new, but its impact came from context. This was the man already under suspicion, the one who'd knocked a Navy SEAL to the courtroom floor. And this, now, was proof of the kind of deep-rooted hate no badge or rank could disguise. Journalists confirmed the video's authenticity within the hour. Date: 8 months ago. Location: the city's southern district, where nearly 60% of residents are black. When reporters asked the local precinct for comment, they got the usual, "We will review it." But this time, that answer wasn't enough, because this time, there was no one left to stand in front of him. The people who once shielded him had run out of justifications, the usual excuses. Unclear footage, miscommunication, aggressive suspect had no place next to a raw, brutal, undeniable clip. He called an elderly woman "monkey lady," with the casual cruelty of someone convinced he'd never be held accountable. But this time, no one stepped in to cover for him. A city council spokesperson responded immediately. "We will not tolerate any act that degrades human dignity, especially from someone sworn to protect the public." Words that once rang hollow now carried weight, matched against a reality peeling back the system layer by layer. McRae didn't speak. He didn't appear. His house was surrounded by media, neighbors turned away, and his social accounts vanished within 20 minutes of the clip going viral. But people didn't forget. His words, his actions, and the system that had enabled him, all were being pieced together into a portrait that was terrifying in its clarity. A man who had never been stopped because those who could stop him had stayed silent too long, and now silence would have a cost. Some things can't be buried in reports. Some sounds can't be erased from the public's mind. And some people, once called animals, are now taking the story back, step by step, until the man who called someone "monkey lady" is finally forced to lower his head in the last courtroom, one without uniforms, without badges, and with nothing left strong enough to hide who he is. She didn't appear on any evening news. There was no hot seat reserved for her on political talk shows, no emotional interviews beneath hundreds of microphones. They came knocking, left business cards, sent offers with generous compensation, and even pitched treatments from major studios. But she remained silent. That choice wasn't a retreat, nor a rejection of truth. It was the only way to preserve its full weight. She had once stood in war zones, seen those who left and never came back, and understood the cost of speaking at the wrong moment. So when reporters called by the hour and headlines danced across screens, she stepped away from the spotlight, not out of fear, but to keep what she did from being shredded into clickbait. Somewhere in this chaos, if people forgot why she struck back, then every praise would become nothing but a coat of cheap varnish, peeling away the next time someone else was drowned. Just west of the courthouse gates, on the bare gray stone wall long untouched by renovation, someone one morning sprayed a line directly onto its rough surface. She didn't break the silence. She beat it. Bold, uppercase letters, thick black paint, edges still fresh, the surface slightly wet. No one knew who wrote it. No camera had captured the moment, but the message felt carved from her very presence. No permission, no apology, no need for applause. It didn't name names, but the whole city knew exactly who it was about. Within a day, that line appeared in countless photos, printed on protest posters, tattooed on a group of law students, and italicized at the end of a civil rights magazine's lead article. Yet she, the eye of the storm, still didn't show. No close friend offered more details. One former teammate, when asked, replied simply, "She's held silence through things none of you could imagine. Don't think TV will change her now." Her absence didn't cool the media firestorm. It redirected it. People began talking about silence itself, the kind trampled and forced upon the voiceless for decades. They realized she didn't speak out to be heard, but because, for once, the oppressor had no microphone left to drown her out. That courtroom counterstrike wasn't a sequence of moves. It was a pure declaration, unedited, untitled, and irreversible. The West Wall was soon ordered repainted by the city council, but the locals blocked the service trucks. They didn't shout, didn't fight. They came with small bricks, placing each one at the foot of the wall, hand-etched with metal files. For her, not just a witness, don't touch our reminder. And perhaps, sensing the momentum now beyond control, the council stepped back. The black spray remained. The internal memo read only one line: postponed due to public safety concerns. But everyone knew this was one of the rare times the government backed down before an illegal act that carried a truth far greater than any law. In the center of the city stood a wall no one dared repaint, a line of words no one tried to erase, a message no one needed to repeat, because it had already taken root in how people began treating one another afterward. The hashtag Silence Strikes Back started from an anonymous account, with no profile picture and following no one. The first post included only those 3 words and a photo of black paint on the stone wall near the courthouse gate. Within less than an hour, the hashtag had spread across every social platform, first among law students, then veterans, and finally communities who had long spoken out against injustice without being heard. It wasn't a slogan from a media team, not pushed by influencers or brands. It moved differently, like something everyone had already thought but never written down. Silence Strikes Back wasn't a call for unity, nor a way to soften the ending. It was a warning, sharp and direct, that what people had long endured in silence could return, uninvited, striking back at those who had grown used to control. No shouting, no demands, only resistance made permanent. Because those forced into silence know this well. Sometimes saying nothing is the loudest form of defiance. Orams, the story was told, but no one called her a hero. No statues were raised. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no poetic lines about justice. Instead, people spoke as if owning a piece of guilt for letting it happen, for staying silent, for once believing McCrae's behavior was just how things were in a system broken from its core. One user wrote, "I saw a black woman dragged out of her car once just because she didn't make eye contact during a stop. I was nearby. I stayed quiet. Today I realize if she had been my sister, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself." A high school teacher posted, "I wrote, she didn't break the silence. She beat it on my classroom board. I don't teach her as a hero. I teach my students that if they witness something wrong, silence is complicity too." The story didn't spread like a campaign. It unraveled like a suppressed memory, not to celebrate her, but to remind each other that silence must not repeat itself, not to build monuments, but to remember the street corners, the guard posts, the times people were called trash or you, and dismissed without consequence. That kind of storytelling kept the story from fading in weeks like other scandals. It didn't just stay in headlines, it slipped into school meetings, essay prompts, middle school writing assignments, and even internal training materials in the justice system. In one public office, they replaced the slogan above the entrance, once integrity, honor, service, with "Never Let Silence." In a city once filled with empty outrage, this story became a mirror, not for the one who struck back, but for everyone who had seen injustice and turned away. That is why the hashtag lasted longer than trends. It wasn't about victory. It was the imprint of a moment when the untouchable was finally challenged, not with screams, but with decisive action, by someone the entire room once saw as nameless. That story no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever stayed silent, everyone who had once looked away, and everyone who now wanted to be certain that next time justice was insulted in plain view, someone would step forward, or at the very least, not step back. 1 week after the incident, Buried under hundreds of angry emails and relentless news cycles, a quiet message was sent through the court's internal system. The sender was a mid-level administrative clerk. Unremarkable, scandal-free, never mentioned in the media. The subject line contained just 2 words: resignation. The body consisted of a single short paragraph. I witnessed it, I stayed silent. No one forced her to say more. But even that was enough to make the sealed doors behind the system tremble for the first time. Words written in silence carry a different weight, especially when they come from someone who has sat beside justice long enough to know that silence, over time, is no longer a choice. It becomes complicity. Her name was Clarice. For 3 years, she transcribed hearings under McCrae's direct supervision. She had never dared speak about that September afternoon last year when McCrae entered the courtroom with a boy barely 18, handcuffed, knees bloodied from being slammed down on the courthouse steps. The teenager did not resist. He kept repeating that he had come to submit documents proving he had completed a voluntary rehab program. Clarice sat behind her typewriter, her face hidden behind a dust-stained glass panel. But she couldn't forget how McCrae grabbed the boy's collar and yanked him from the audience bench like he was dragging nameless luggage. McCrae's voice rang loud, deliberately so. "This kind is a social virus. He reeks of southern slum trash." No one in the room responded. Even the judge that day merely flipped through the file without looking up. There was no surveillance camera due to technical issues. The boy was dragged away. Clarice couldn't remember his name, only the way his hand trembled, how he tried to speak, then froze when he met McCrae's eyes. Eyes devoid of reason, filled with absolute a kind of power so aged it had turned into reflex. "I drag you because I want to." No explanation needed. Clarice submitted a full transcript, but when the draft returned from final review, the phrase social virus had been replaced with disruptive civilian in courtroom vicinity. She quietly corrected and signed her name. Clarice kept silent until she saw McCrae struck down in court, surrounded by people who didn't know how to react. It was the first time she saw someone who had long gone unchallenged, brought to the floor by a victim with battlefield precision. That moment made her realize the time had come, not to fix what she had ignored, but to end the days of blind complicity. Aside from her brief paragraph, she included no justification, but someone in the administrative office later found a sticky note on her desk. Never sent. The handwriting slanted slightly. "I thought I was doing the right thing by not causing more trouble, but really, I was helping trouble survive." News of the resignation email spread within 2 days. No one asked Clarice to return. She didn't need defense or public sympathy. She just wanted to leave as someone who had finally understood what enough meant. And if people remembered her at all, it would be for the fact that she could have kept turning away, but chose to let go of the office chair for the first time in her life, so justice wouldn't be written in counterfeit words. Clarice never attended a press conference. Her name wasn't on any exclusive interview lists, nor did she appear on national television. But that quietness made her words travel farther than any statement could. In her internal resignation letter to the judicial system, the final line had, "No thanks, no wishes, just a single sentence. I don't want to be old, explaining to my grandchild why I stayed silent." Less than 6 hours later, the image of the letter spread wider than the evening news. It wasn't mentioned by TV anchors, nor distorted into a marketing slogan. What gripped readers was its brutal clarity, plain words, and sharp truth. In a world where everyone tries to write beautifully, to speak with flair, that one line struck harder than 100 moral essays. The photo was first reshared by a young attorney, then a high school teacher, and soon by dozens of community accounts. Within 24 hours, the phrase, "Why I Stayed Silent," appeared on banners at more than 12 peaceful gatherings across major cities. No one mentioned Clarice by name, but everyone understood. Someone who had once been silent had left her desk with a question that made the system flinch. Notably, while major media continued to focus on official responses, legal rebuttals, and expert analysis, it was that resignation letter that made people stop. It didn't dissect policy or demand reform. It posed the one thing most had thought but never said. If we keep staying silent, how long will it take for the truth to break through the wall of comfort and fear? And so people began to ask, how many other Clarices are still behind courtroom doors? Police desks, notary counters, compliance offices. What have they seen, deleted, chosen to ignore, and how many believe that one day they will have to sit across from their children and explain that silence? Clarice answered none of the messages that followed. Her phone was off. Her inbox declined every interview. When a former colleague was asked, they simply said, "She's gone. And I think it's the best thing she's done in 10 years. The local paper, which had never once reported on her, devoted an entire reader response column 3 days later to articles titled "The Quiet Act of a Clerk." They hadn't caught the wave on time, but they couldn't ignore what one letter, fewer than 10 words long, had set off. From that point forward, whenever someone spoke of system reform, they didn't reference landmark lawsuits, elections, or pending bills. They said, someone once wrote, she didn't want to grow old, explaining to her grandchild why she said nothing. That sentence became a milestone, no longer belonging to one person, but sitting quietly on the desks of hundreds. A soft reminder, sharp as a blade, resting beside the business cards of public servants paid to do what is right. The man in the video wore a faded gray t-shirt and leaned against a brick wall. His voice was low and steady, not seeking pity or attention, but every word cracked open memories buried in silence. He slammed my head to the ground, he said, just because I asked where the bus stop was. No dramatics, no tears, just a quiet truth that set off a wave the system couldn't stop. In less than 2 hours, hundreds of stories surfaced, people from different cities, different ages, all saying the same thing. I knew him. That was me. I still have the papers. Some sent blurry photos of citations. Others submitted full reports long ignored. A girl posted a recording of McCrae's voice. Who do you think you're calling? I am the law around here. Over 170 anonymous testimonies flooded public accountability platforms in just one day. Most of them had never seen the light of day. Some buried by expired deadlines. Others erased under the label "handled internally," but now, protected by anonymity, they could speak freely, no longer needing to prove they were perfect victims. A group of law students started building a timeline. Within 48 hours, they released a live digital map showing every place McCrae had been tied to reports of coercion, intimidation, or racially charged abuse. Around the courthouse, in the southern neighborhoods, near bus depots and school zones, the yellow markers lit up like warnings left too long unread. If justice bends this easily in every corner, one student wrote, no wonder people stopped believing in it. At a closed-door meeting between oversight boards and the city's police officials, the full report was printed out. Nearly 200 pages. No one defended McCrae, not even the city attorney. The room fell into that rare kind of silence that doesn't ask for answers, only accountability. By then, no one dared call it a mistake. No one could pretend he snapped under pressure. The testimonies from everyday people, once labeled as disruptive, uncooperative, or unworthy, now formed the strongest case of all. It wasn't about one man's misconduct anymore. It was about a system that had fed him power by letting silence do the work. One mother didn't write a report. She just posted an old photo. Her son, 8 years old, wearing a black hoodie, holding his backpack. He was called a lost monkey, right in front of me. The cop's name was McCrae, just because of the hoodie. She didn't cry in the video. She didn't raise her voice. But somehow, her restraint hit even harder, like someone who had practiced staying calm for too many years until anger no longer felt like an option. She used to think no one would believe her. When she took her son to the police station, the officer at the desk asked, "Do you have proof?" She pulled out her phone. But McCrae only smirked and said coldly, "Next time, teach your kid to dress properly." That's how people earn respect. That night she stayed silent. The next day, too. Her son asked, "Are you angry, Mom?" She stroked his hair and said yes. Then they went out for ice cream like nothing had happened, because she feared that any bigger reaction would get him labeled as a problem. It was the last time her son wore a hoodie in public. When the first video of McRae went viral, she watched it over and over. When she saw the punch, the stare, the way he slammed into the courtroom bench, she didn't feel joy. She felt something else. Someone had finally acted for all the people who had stayed quiet, who had tried so hard to be decent just to avoid having more taken from them. From then on, hundreds began telling their own stories. None were famous. None wore uniforms, but they all had one thing in common. They thought no one would care. Being pulled from lines, snapped at, ticketed for no reason, watched when walking through rich neighborhoods, they once accepted it as the price for staying left alone. But now, after someone stood up without waiting for permission, they no longer wanted to pay that price in silence. One comment was shared more than 10,000 times beneath various posts. All of us stayed silent because we thought we were alone. But now someone hit back, not out of love for violence, but because sometimes a punch is the only language the system understands. A group of students created a site to document civil complaints against McRae and the system that enabled him. Under Why I'm Sharing, a new option appeared because someone dared to act. You didn't have to be a warrior or the main character. People began speaking up not to demand justice for the past, but to build new instincts, to not look away when wrong appears, to not treat small wrongs as normal, and to not let any insult be forgotten, just because it wasn't caught on tape. Beneath one post, someone wrote, "I've been slapped. I've been laughed at for the name on my ID. I've been pulled from a line for staying quiet. But now I know silence is no longer the way." And in all those shared stories, no one used the word victim. They called each other by their real names, with the dignity once stained now being reclaimed line by line, story by story, through truths that needed no vindication. Because from now on, it wasn't about proving anything, it was about remembering. In response to the flood of testimonies and public outcry, a familiar tactic was deployed. McRae's attorney appeared in front of a row of media microphones during a hastily arranged but calculated press conference. Wearing a crisp suit with a steady voice and stony face, he looked straight into the cameras and opened with a line heard too many times before. "My client was brutally assaulted while performing his duty." The statement sparked immediate backlash, not because it was believed, but because it came from the same system that had ignored hundreds of complaints against McRae. Sensational headlines followed. "Officer attacked in courtroom." But this time, the public didn't take the bait. Online comments were sharp, direct, and unflinching. The attorney presented a stack of medical documents claiming mild concussion, occipital hematoma, level 2 psychological trauma. Scans were shown and notes from a private doctor were shared. Experts quickly responded. Nothing in the scans indicated life-threatening injuries. One military-trained physician commented, "A man who psychologically tortured others now claiming mental trauma? That's grotesque irony." The narrative split in two. On one side, the effort to frame McRae as a victim. On the other hand, the voices of those who had suffered under him, unwilling to let smooth words erase the truth. A photo of McRae in a hospital bed with a bandaged hand appeared in local newspapers, but readers posted screenshots of his past insults underneath, each one turning his pain into a pale echo of what he had inflicted. A retired teacher wrote, "He once expelled an 8th grader for saying good morning with the wrong tone. Now he claims psychological harm? What about the damage he left behind in those kids?" This backlash didn't stem from rage, it came from memory. Collective memory. People who had once stayed silent now chose to speak. No medical report or legal panel could reshape what they had witnessed. They had seen a man who wielded his power to humiliate now beg for mercy after being struck by someone he underestimated. Balanced coverage on television couldn't balance the public conscience. On one live show, a woman stood up, hands trembling, voice firm. If that punch felt too much for him, maybe he should count how many of us he's pinned to the ground with those hands. No one spoke of McRae's dignity anymore. No one called him a long-serving officer. Those titles sounded absurd against the weight of testimony. What he faced wasn't outrage, it was the consequence, and what his lawyers offered as a shield only made clearer how the system had long mistaken paperwork for protection. This time, no one forgot, no one forgave, and no one bowed to call him a victim. The courtroom was thought to be where truth triumphs, but in the days following the blow, what surfaced wasn't truth, it was selectivity. McRae's legal team cited laws, quoted penal codes, and firmly declared, "We are here to judge the incident in the courtroom that day, not his entire personal history." Mainstream outlets accepted that boundary without question, but the public did not let it go so easily. An anonymous account posted screenshots of internal police messages from years earlier. In them, McRae had written about a group of black protesters. "Fire a few shots in the air and toss some moldy bread, they'll scatter." In another thread, he sent a monkey emoji, followed by the note, "Brown folks demanding rights again." Those messages were never introduced in court records, never brought up during hearings. When a reporter asked why, the defense attorney replied flatly, "Not relevant to the case." For the first time, the public began to see the law itself may not be broken, but it often picks a side, and that side rarely belongs to those without power. The most shared post across social media came from a young activist. "This is the hardest truth. It's not that the law is blind, it's that it chooses to pretend it can't see." The sentence was printed on shirts, stuck to the backs of laptops, and scrawled in black marker across subway walls. People didn't wait for a verdict. They judged through memory, through what McRae had done, said, and laughed about. No one was surprised that the court didn't admit the old messages as evidence, but that omission became its kind of proof that there is a gap between the truth and the truth allowed to stand. On community platforms, a post by a former officer went viral. "I served with McRae. What he said off camo was worse. We used to think it's nothing. I'm ashamed I ever thought that." The name McRae now stood only for exposure, a symbol of selective justice, of a system draped in fairness, but always pulling back when blood touched its hands. A local paper ran an editorial titled, "Not the First Time, but Maybe the Last." Below it, they listed no fewer than 8 dismissed complaints tied to McRae, each marked with phrases like insufficient evidence, withdrawn, no further action. There was no need for more trials. No one needed another court. They judged him in their minds, in every cautious glance exchanged with police, in every time their names were mispronounced in public, in every silence born of fear. An elderly woman commented on a post, "This is the first time my voice didn't feel useless." She recalled being searched aggressively by McRae at a market years ago because he thought she was hiding stolen food. When she asked why, he said, "Suspicion is enough." No one claimed justice had won, but everyone knew silence was no longer an option. And if the law refused to face the truth, the people had learned how to point at it themselves, not to accuse, but to remind. Every time the truth is pushed aside, justice loses a piece of its soul. 1 week after the incident, the headlines had moved beyond legal matters. This time, the silence came from institutions once expected to uphold the truth. Federal veterans organizations, long considered a voice for those who served the country, jointly signed a petition sent directly to the Government Oversight Office. Their demand was clear and firm: an independent investigation, free from police internal affairs and untouched by local political influence. The federal press secretary gave no response. The Department of Justice spokesperson simply repeated one sentence at a press briefing: "We are gathering information and have no official comment at this time." Each word was a cold erasure of the public's final hope. Everyone realized that when the perpetrator wore a uniform, the system no longer knew which side to take. At the same time, several defense-focused news outlets began removing articles that once praised SEAL warriors, including those featuring her. No specific reason was given, but on a military forum, an anonymous administrator wrote, "To maintain neutrality, we must remove controversial posts." A harmless line on the surface, but it exposed how symbols are used and discarded at the whim of whoever controls the narrative. That neutrality sparked more outrage than the punch in the courtroom. A female veteran who had served alongside her published an open letter on social media. Neutrality is not silence. Neutrality is the courage to ask questions when someone who fought for freedom is humiliated in the very place meant to protect justice. The letter was shared tens of thousands of times, but major platforms remained quiet, as if ignoring it would make the story disappear. She did not appear, did not comment, did not confirm or deny anything, but this silence was different. No longer endurance. It was a mirror held up to society. The more people tried to erase her name, the more others began searching for it. An independent journalist launched a podcast series about Black women who served in the military, but were erased upon returning. In the first episode, he said, "She's not the only victim, but she's the first to make the whole room fall silent just by standing." In the old backups, her name was still there, but in the official system, she had never existed. Military media centers declined to comment. A fellow officer who once co-taught with her responded to the press with just 3 words, "I don't know." Short, cold, and hollow. The way a system erases a person. Not through denial, but by refusing to speak at all. A former instructor posted a long piece on a private forum for special forces. When a woman who once took a bullet for her team is erased for standing up in court, the one wounded is not just her, it's the entire moral foundation we once believed in. The post was taken down within 3 hours. Reasons cited: promoting internal division, but it had already been copied, reshared like wildfire, and with it a question began echoing everywhere, in online threads, corner cafes, political science classes, even housewife chat groups. If they can raise someone who sacrificed for them, what reason do they need to erase us? No one could answer that question, and no one dared dismiss it, because deep down, everyone sensed the same fear, that this system does not distinguish between right and wrong, only between compliant and defiant. And if she, once honored for her courage, could be treated as flawed simply for resisting, then honor itself had become a conditional prize. A group of law students held an unofficial forum on campus titled, "She used to be in the curriculum, where is she now?" Her deleted personnel file was printed and pasted across the meeting room walls. There were no speakers, no microphones. Each attendee received a slip of paper. Write what you'd feel if one day your name was erased from what you bled to build. Among those notes, one line was shared most widely: "We're not defending a person. We're fighting against being forced to forget, because forgetting is how the system avoids consequences, how it turns disgrace into dust, how it hides wounds beneath silence." But this memory would not be dismissed so easily. It was fed by outrage, carried by those who once thought they had no voice. Like a torn piece of cloth, each cover-up only ripped the gap wider. And through that tear, people saw more clearly than ever who was being quietly pushed out and who was quietly benefiting from it. She never reappeared to contest her erasure. She gave no interviews, wrote no statements, but everyone knew her silence was not surrender. It was clear that if a system requires deletion to protect its image, then that image no longer deserves protection. And those who once believed in it now had to ask themselves, what are we fighting for? Because the true danger is not betrayal. In a small auditorium at a high school in an eastern state, where light filtered through old window panes and suspended dust seemed to hold still in the air, a special discussion took place titled "Response and the Law." There were no legal experts, no invited officials, just a history teacher, a few dozen students, and a whiteboard marked in thick marker, "What happens if you stay silent?" On the screen was a summary of the McRae incident, carefully edited to fit the bounds of a standard high school lesson. No violent scenes, no combat footage, just one final slide that read, "A woman who once served in the military, responded after a series of abuses by police. As the class fell into silence after the screening, a white student, young-faced and genuinely curious, raised his hand. He stood up and asked a simple question that cut through the entire context. What would have happened if she didn't hit back? The teacher, a woman in her 40s who had taught at the school for over a decade, didn't answer right away. She looked at the blurred photo of the woman cut from a news clip, then turned back to the class. Her voice was calm and even. Probably no one would have known. The sentence landed like a blade to the gut of truth. It thickened the air in the classroom, like someone had touched a nerve the whole society had learned to avoid. One girl whispered to her desk mate, "You mean if she kept quiet, it would have all just passed?" Her friend replied, "Not would have. It always does." The teacher nodded slowly, confirming that this wasn't speculation. Then she continued, "When you're insulted, dragged from a chair, humiliated, if you don't react, others will assume it's normal, and the system will repeat it. On to the next person." From the back of the class, a quiet black student stood up. So her reaction was wrong, but silence changes nothing. What do we do when both choices get us judged? The teacher had no perfect answer, but she pointed to the board. "What happens if you stay silent?" Then flipped the marker and wrote beneath it, "What happens if you don't?" In that moment, the entire class understood the lesson wasn't about right or wrong. It was about not pretending to be blind. A video less than 30 seconds long surfaced on Twitter that weekend. The setting? A classroom, background noise of scribbling pens and pale ceiling lights. No music, no transitions. Just one line of subtitle on a black screen at the start. What would have happened if she didn't hit back? Then the teacher's voice, calm but piercing, probably no one would have known. Within 2 days, the clip had over 3 million views. Users began reposting it with the same caption, as if sparked by a collective memory. No one knew because we all got used to being quiet. The hashtag #SheFoughtBack spread across platforms. Under every reenactment video were thousands of comments. "I saw something like this once, but stayed silent out of fear. My brother was beaten at the station. No one believed him. I was only 17 and I just stood there while they dragged my father away. No one had to organize it. These stories connected on their own." And each one became a broken link in the chain of silence. Meanwhile, in a suburb just a few miles from the courthouse, McCrae lived in a gated apartment complex. No one protested outside his home. No flyers were thrown into his yard. But everything began to shift, in the way places that once pretended to feel nothing started to whisper. The corner supermarket where he used to buy beer no longer kept his name on the rewards list. Cashiers avoided eye contact when he walked in. Once, he heard someone whisper behind him, "Is that him?" No one pointed, but he knew. And then, he turned around and left, abandoning a full cart. He had not been charged. The complaint forms sent to the police department were all marked under review. Old video clips were classified as lacking direct corroborating evidence. On paper, everything remained unchanged. But real power was no longer in his hands. It had shifted into the eyes of those who once kept their heads down and were now beginning to watch, into the silence left in the space where his footsteps passed, into the moment he could no longer enter a store he once knew as well as his own oichin, not because anyone stopped him, but because he understood silent stares weighed heavier than accusations. And within that silence, he began to feel something that those he once insulted had carried for years, the sense of not belonging, the feeling of being seen as a threat just by existing, the understanding that no words were needed to know he was not welcome. McCrae locked his door earlier than before. Curtains stayed drawn even during daylight. Once, a child playing nearby accidentally dropped a ball into his yard. The child did not dare ring the bell, just looked, then ran away. No one had to teach them to be afraid, but maybe, somewhere, on a short video, or in a clipped news segment, they had heard that name and knew that yard was not safe. On a small street just 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, a local t-shirt shop, usually known for class uniforms and birthday prints, suddenly received an order of over 5,000 shirts. Each bore a simple phrase printed boldly across the chest. She didn't wait to be protected. Black fabric, white letters, plain font. But every person who placed an order knew they weren't wearing it for fashion. They wore it because they saw themselves in that punch. The shop owner recalled how, on the first day orders opened, someone drove 3 hours just to pick one up in person. An elderly woman, her hands trembling, opened her wallet to pay for one shirt, saying she would wash it daily, to wear to work, to the market, and when walking past the police station near her home. They weren't coming to buy a shirt. They came to wear the fury buried inside them for far too long. Within days, the hashtag "not waiting for permission" spread across platforms. Beneath each post were long, raw, unedited stories. I used to fear speaking up, afraid of retaliation, but now I won't wait for someone to protect me. Each story struck like a drumbeat against the old, silent society that had grown used to. On an old brick wall near the courthouse, a street artist, his name unknown, began painting an image no one expected. Her back was shown, face obscured by sunlight, hair braided, shoulders straight, stride unwavering. Behind her shadow stood a SEAL warrior, helmet, rifle slung over the shoulder, body solid. But ahead of her feet was McCrae's shadow, collapsed, badge flung aside, gun broken, and beneath it all the caption, "Sometimes justice needs a punch to wake up." The mural was finished overnight. The next morning, people paused as they passed. A child holding bread stared at it in awe. A woman in office clothes wiped tears from her face. Some took pictures, some bowed their heads. No one spoke loudly, yet the entire street fell quiet in a different kind of silence, as if each brick had absorbed a new layer of memory, and no one wanted to let it slip. Local authorities hesitated. The mural had no permit. The wall belonged to a public building, but even those assigned to erase unauthorized graffiti hesitated. A young officer looked at the wall and told his superior, "If I paint over this, people will record it, and I don't want to be the next one standing on the wrong side." There was no document declaring the mural a landmark, no ribbon cutting, no grand speech, but from the day it appeared, that street grew busier. People came not to film, but just to stand there for a few seconds, reminding themselves, someone once didn't wait for permission, and because of that, she became the reason others dared to step forward. And that wall, once meaningless, became a place where people slowed down, nodded, and walked away stronger. Not because she was a hero, but because she reminded them, you don't need to be called a hero to fight back. You just need to rise at the right moment. 1 week after the incident, in a small cafe in the southern suburbs, 5 women gathered around an old wooden table, eyes sharper than ever. They hadn't known each other before, but shared one truth. They were single mothers, each having felt powerless when their children were treated unfairly and no one stood up for them. The story of the punch in the courtroom didn't scare them. It made them realize it was time to build something, so no one would ever have to act alone again. The Citizen Self-Defense Alliance was born from a text thread, which turned into an online meeting, then their first in-person gathering. It wasn't a formal organization, no legal paperwork, no operating budget, but within 3 days, their social media page drew over 20,000 followers. Women from other states messaged asking to join, requesting resources and advice. One woman wrote, "I once stood crying in a supermarket with my child after we were searched like criminals. I don't want to stay silent next time." They began drafting plans with lawyers to release a handbook titled Legal Self-Defense, teaching people how to respond lawfully when faced with threats, discrimination, or unreasonable force from authorities. They shared audio recordings, taught how to remember badge numbers, how to activate legal video recording, and how to call for witnesses in public spaces. Every tip was shared hundreds of times, along with a clear message. Not all of us are trained to fight back, but we can learn not to be crushed ever again. While groups began to form, a father named Marcus Hill, living in a neighboring state, wrote a short statement on his page. "I taught my daughter how to yell back. not bow her head. Just one line, but more than 30,000 shares in less than 2 days. Beneath the post were countless images of other parents showing their children learning self-defense, learning to use their phones to record audio, and learning how to tell the difference between a legal search warrant and an act of intimidation. Marcus was not an activist. He worked as a delivery driver, once ordered to lie face down on the pavement because his vehicle matched the description of a theft. He had considered filing a lawsuit, but gave up after being warned he would be watched. He stayed silent until he saw the video of the female operative being shoved out of her seat in the courtroom. In her eyes, he saw the same buried fury he had once carried, and he knew if he said nothing to his daughter today, then when she was one day insulted, he would no longer have the right to defend her with words. Marcus's post was remixed into countless inspirational videos. Some used the quote for classroom bulletin boards. One basketball coach wrote it on the team strategy board for young players. No longer just a complaint, it became a survival command. Either you respond or you get. No single act of personal resistance had ever stopped society in its tracks like this. What woke people up was not blood or impact sounds, it was the image of a woman standing tall among those who believed they were the law and saying one sentence that silenced the entire system. "I don't need your permission to stand." And from that moment, everyone looked at their children, looked at themselves, and asked, "Am I still sitting here, waiting for someone else to stand up for me?" The official statement was printed on white paper, black text, standard administrative font, no exclamation marks, no humanizing introduction. The title read, "Regarding internal adjustment of conduct policy within the local judicial system." Beneath it were 2 short paragraphs noting that the Department of Justice had received some feedback from citizens and was in the process of reviewing professional conduct at courtroom sites. Not once did the statement use the word assault, nor did it mention victim. They referred to the entire sequence of humiliation, threats, and abuse in the courtroom simply as the incident. McRae was labeled an involved individual, while she, dragged, shoved, demeaned, and ultimately forced to fight back, was called a citizen participating in litigation. That erasure wasn't accidental. It followed a familiar tactic: dilute responsibility by obscuring the people involved. When names are omitted, individuals dissolve into vague symbols, swept away like dust in the bureaucratic wind. And that, more than the absence of an apology, was what made people furious. Responses came instantly. One lawyer wrote, "I read it 3 times and saw no one held accountable." A former investigative journalist added, "If a woman is choked in court, and this is the only statement issued, you'll understand. This system doesn't forget, it chooses." On Twitter, someone paired the phrase, "in the process of reviewing," with a photo of the courtroom where it all happened, captioned, "While they review, people die silently." The image went viral, a symbol of how bureaucracy faces personal pain with a cold, surgical distance. One local newspaper printed the headline, "No name, no blood, no problem." Below, a bitter op-ed exposed how the system was rewriting events to make sure no one gets hurt, except the person who already was. Online, people began referring to her with a new name, the one they won't name, not to erase her identity, but to highlight the government's avoidance of responsibility. A thread read, "Did you read the statement?" "Yes. It mentioned everything except the one who mattered." A veteran on a military forum wrote, "If they won't say the name of someone who protected this country, they don't deserve to call this country theirs." His words appeared on over 100 posts from fellow veterans. They didn't need marches to speak. They only needed to confirm. This silence was no longer indifference, it was organized complicity. While the Department of Justice kept reviewing, many stopped waiting. They acted. No need for titles or policies. Because after the punch, after that look, after being called an unidentified citizen, they refused to let the truth be rewritten by administrative font again. At the State Bar Association conference, in a windowless room lined with suits and indifferent gazes, a black female attorney with her hair neatly tied stood at the podium. No script, no laptop, just a steady voice, looking straight into the panel and the camera lens. "They won't say her name," she said, firm but low, because they're afraid to face their wrong. That sentence lasted only 15 words, yet each one landed like a punch to the chest of the room. Not out of anger, but with the kind of truth that makes a person feel their skin being peeled away. Just below the podium, some lifted their heads. Others looked down, as if searching for something on their phones. The air was neither loud nor chaotic. It thickened, pressing inward. But when the speech was rebroadcast on local television, that entire segment was gone. In its place was a smooth transition, voiceover reading. Representatives from the legal field have offered many constructive insights regarding fairness in prosecution. No one mentioned why it was cut. No one asked who gave the order. But online, the original footage, recorded from another corner of the room, low in quality and echoing, was shared just minutes after the broadcast ended. The caption began spreading, "You know what the system fears when it won't let you hear even one full sentence." The videos were repeatedly taken down on several platforms, but people had already saved, reposted, translated, and subtitled them. "They won't say her name, because her name reveals them." It spread beyond the local region, becoming the central message of a wave of online discussions about constitutional rights and civil dissent. Law students began printing stills from the speech, captioned with the full unaired quote, and plastering them across university bulletin boards. A media research group published an analysis. Signal interruption is a soft form of censorship, but its backlash is that people start asking what they weren't allowed to hear, and they found it. That female attorney did not become a media celebrity. She accepted no interview requests afterward, posted nothing on social media, but people repeated her words like a new incantation for the times. If you are afraid to say the name of someone oppressed, that name holds power, and if the entire system avoids it in unison, you should start writing it down. And they did, on t-shirts, on brick walls, outpost-its, stuck in elevators, train stations, and bus stops. Not her real name, but a description unmistakable. The one they want forgotten, but her body won't let them. Because anyone who saw her eyes that day, who witnessed that punch in a room full of badges, would never read a soulless press release the same way again. No one needed to get the full name right to know who was being referenced, and no one needed a TV channel to confirm what happened in that courtroom, because if the truth must wait for broadcast, permission, or official sanction, it will always be cut right after the words, "She was." But this time, they heard the full sentence, and they will not let it be cut again. At a closed-door city council meeting, a proposal titled "The Woman Who Fought Back" was submitted by a group of law students. They weren't asking for a statue in a grand square, nor did they suggest a realistic portrait. It was simply a symbolic figure, a clenched fist, placed in a public space as a reminder of the right to self-defense in places supposedly ruled by justice. The proposal was carefully worded in neutral language, avoiding any mention of her name or courtroom specifics, an effort to shield it from accusations of social divisiveness. Even so, it was rejected. The reason cited: the work contains politically sensitive elements, may divide the public, and could unnecessarily inflame current tensions. No one needed to read the minutes closely to understand what those bureaucratic words meant. They feared a symbol too real, too near, and too powerful. A clenched fist, even cast in bronze or carved in limestone, said more than 100 polished badges. A statue might be taken down, but a reflex can't be erased from collective memory. And so, though no statue was built, the symbol began to appear in ways no one could control. On hearing benches in later trials, small drawings showed up at the wood's edge. Black ink lines, clenched fists. Not large, not camera-worthy, but unmistakable to anyone who had followed the story. Someone seemed to sit there, silently draw it, then leave without a trace. Just a subtle nudge to memories blurred by sanitized statements. Soon, the image appeared during civil trials, then spread to minor offense hearings. Even in places with no cameras, the familiar symbol turned up in paperwork piles or on shirt cuffs. A former court employee recalled cleaning the courtroom one gray afternoon and discovering 13 tiny fists carved with fingernails into the wood. Each was in a different spot, etched to varying depths, all pointing in the same direction, the witness stand. This uncommissioned symbol became the first unofficial monument. No ribbon cutting, no artist's name, no tourist plaques. Yet everyone entering that space for the first time, upon seeing the mark, reacted the same. They paused, not necessarily because they understood its origin, but because they felt something unresolved had happened there. Some judges were displeased, claiming the drawings disrupted court, but they couldn't ban personal pens, nor catch the artist in the act. Attempts to erase them failed. They reappeared days later, this time in a new corner or embedded in case files, as if, instead of building a statue, people chose something more powerful to leave it wherever justice needed a reminder. And in the long silence of official institutions, it was those rough ink marks that completed the work of an unfinished verdict. Because sometimes, what keeps a society from forgetting isn't loud speeches, but a small mark, repeated until denial is no longer an option. The meeting took place on an unnamed morning in a quiet roadside cafe where no one paid attention to casually dressed people speaking softly without cameras. The reporter was a middle-aged woman, gray hair neatly pinned, eyes seasoned, carrying no recorder. She wasn't there for a broadcast or a book deal. She just wanted to understand, not the event, but the person. When she sat down, she didn't make small talk. She simply pulled out a small notebook, set it beside a glass of water, and asked in a steady voice, cutting through the quiet tension, "Do you think you've changed anything?" She didn't respond immediately. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a glow on her firm jawline and revealing an old scar, a faint line near her ear, visible only to those patient enough to notice. It wasn't from the courtroom incident, but from a past event she'd never spoken of, in a different place, under different circumstances. "No," she said slowly, her voice husky yet resolute. "I haven't changed anything. I just reminded them that if they step on me, I'll step back." That remark wasn't recorded in any interview. The journalist didn't quote it in the subsequent report. Yet, among reporters, it circulated like a password, unspoken but understood. Though it never made headlines, every principled journalist recognized it as the true essence of the story. Her presence in courtrooms, the sketches at the witness stand, the shirts bearing that phrase, "None aim to alter policies or dismantle systems." She didn't initiate a movement, lead a team, or rally crowds. She entered a space designed to suppress and simply refused to endure it any longer. Since then, discussions in security academies have shifted. In scenario training classes, students are prompted to analyze unexpected situations, facing questions like, what happens when the person you underestimate is better trained than you? Though absent from textbooks, her actions cast a shadow over every instructor's query. Even those who once sided with McCrae, not out of support, but habit, no longer feel at ease. Some have transferred departments, others opted for early retirement. The rest remain quietly cautious, not just fearing lack of institutional backing, but also wary that the next victim might not stay silent as she once did. As the journalist departed the cafe, she glanced back, catching the woman's gaze through the window. It wasn't seeking approval, nor was it apologetic or plaintive. It was the look of someone who had measured the consequences and knew the cost of retaliation, but acted anyway, believing inaction would be the greater shame. Though that interview wasn't broadcast, no hashtags trended afterward, one truth was indelibly etched. Sometimes, what society remembers isn't a grand speech or a heroic image, but a sharp, unwavering declaration. If they step on me, I'll step back. McCrae vanished from the police force as if he had never existed. His file was archived, and the termination letter cited only personal health reasons, without mentioning any misconduct. But in the neighborhood where he used to live, his front gate remained shut. Children no longer played nearby. Delivery drivers dropped packages from a distance, and those who once greeted him now walked faster past his house. Not because he had been convicted, but because everyone understood that staying silent for too long could stain you like complicity. Everything he once carried as an officer, his gun, badge, and authority to make others freeze, was gone. Yet no one came to cuff him. There were no indictments, no suspended sentence, no public internal investigation. The system closed the case the way it always did when trying to shield one link from collapsing the entire chain. Then, something that would have seemed far-fetched a year ago began to happen. A petition, launched by a group of law students entitled Character Over Uniform, the campaign called for a nationwide review of police recruitment. In 60 days, over 800,000 signatures were collected, from mothers afraid to take their kids out at night, to white men who had seen friends called dogs for simply asking an officer's name. The petition included a detailed report with excerpts from the McCrae case, statistics on ignored complaints, and heat maps of areas with high police misconduct. It wasn't written with rage, but with the voice of people too tired to plead anymore. It wasn't seeking punishment, just asking one question. If the recruitment system couldn't screen out someone like McCrae, was it helping or enabling? The only reply came in the form of a bureaucratic document titled Insufficient Grounds to Adjust Existing Protocols. No explanation, no spokesperson appeared, and even the name was replaced with authorized representative. The immediate result was not riots, but a wave of disillusionment. Those who still believed that paperwork, law, and process could bring change began to question that belief. Because if 800,000 voices, backed by facts and history, still weren't enough to reform how people with guns are selected, then what would ever be? For the first time in nearly 2 decades of the Internal Affairs complaint intake system, a new form was uploaded to the portal, where the name of the complainant field was replaced by a small box, not required. There was no official announcement, no press conference declaring a policy shift, just a quiet line of code in the technical update log. But anyone who had followed long enough understood that sometimes the smallest change signals a real rupture. In the early weeks, the number of submitted reports rose slightly. Not dramatically, but after a story by an independent journalist, the same who had covered the McCrae case, the number tripled, then quintupled. Dozens of testimonies appeared in plain language, free of legal jargon, just brief fragments. I was pulled from my car even though I showed my license, or my brother was held because he wore a hoodie, asked if he had a gun. Each account was a small scratch, but stacked together, they formed a picture too sharp to ignore. And the most haunting part was not the number of incidents, but how nearly all the submissions were anonymous. Because behind each sentence, behind each line break, lay a truth society knew all too well. The person brave enough to sign their name is usually the first to be punished before they're protected. There were names once known from past complaints, then suddenly gone from the timeline of justice. Some were transferred, some dismissed without cause, some rumored to have mental issues, all leaving no trace except a deep fear. That's why this quiet change was so widely welcomed, because it didn't demand extraordinary courage. It only required one act, faceless, but powerful enough to echo into a collective voice. During a small seminar at a law school, an elderly professor noted, "When a system demands the oppressed publicly name themselves as victims to receive help, that system has betrayed justice itself." That line was copied by hand, then appeared on the front page of a resistance account with over 1 million followers. They added one sentence: "No one needs to sign their name to speak the truth. They only need to know it won't be silent." From that point, each anonymous complaint became a slice into the facade of power that once shielded names like McCrae. It revealed that the system, though stubborn, had begun to crack. Cracks too wide to patch with bureaucracy or media spin. Each anonymous writer was a hammer striking the door of silence, blow after blow, until the hinges began to give. And even though McCrae was gone, even though many who once protected him still sat in their same chairs, what changed was this: People no longer had to choose between telling the truth and being punished. They didn't need applause or to become symbols. They only needed to know that this time, if they were hit, they wouldn't be hit alone, because someone once stood up in the courtroom and struck back, not with words, not with tears, but with a blow from someone who had served in the SEALs. That hit wasn't aimed at McCrae, but at the entire order that once allowed him to think he was the law. And from that moment on, every anonymous complaint was no longer a cry for help, but a warning. The law still picks sides. Those once silenced will make their voice heard. No name needed, no permission asked. She left the city one morning without warning. No heavy luggage, no farewells, and not a single forwarding address. Those who tried to track her down returned empty-handed, all hearing the same reply from the neighborhood: "She's not here anymore." But that didn't mean she had disappeared. What she left behind was clearer than any location on a map. It lived in the quiet but persistent changes, taking root in every corner of the system that once tried to crush her. In training centers for new citizens, courses that once dryly outlined personal rights, reporting protocols, and crisis handling now included a new section: legal self-defense. No one mentioned her name, but on the final page of the training manual there was always a familiar image. No face, no distinguishing features, just the moment a fist was raised, solid and steady like belief itself. A frame that didn't need repeating to leave a mark, because it had already become instinct for those who once felt pushed back simply for not fitting the standard mold society preferred. Human rights organizations also shifted their approach. They no longer relied on tearful victim photos or injury statistics. Instead, in their newly published national guides, they chose one symbol: the image of that punch, as a blunt but piercing assertion. We were not born to bow. Below the image was a small, italicized line that few forgot after reading it once, not because she was a special operative, but because she refused to be a victim ever again. Her story didn't end with a legal victory, nor with public redemption. It ended with the spread of a decision, a choice to stand up while others still wavered between endurance and silence. The lesson wasn't about physical strength or her military background. It was in the moment people realized that justice doesn't always come from the judge's bench or a signature on legislation. Sometimes it arrives from the last reflex of a person who decides they won't let anyone step on them again. In a society where words are often edited and pain reduced to statistics, her resolve, even just a few seconds of it, became a milestone that couldn't be ignored. Policies might stall, perpetrators might temporarily escape court, but one well-timed punch was enough to force the question the system had long avoided: who has the power to stop this? And perhaps that's what mattered most. She never asked to be honored, never demanded apologies, statues, or tributes. She knew that monuments could be torn down and names erased, but the reflex she planted in others was untouchable. She didn't need to be remembered as a hero, because even that title was often crafted to decorate systems that once abandoned her. She only needed to be known as the first who didn't back down, and made others start stepping forward. They no longer remember her name, and she never asked them to. But ever since that punch, people began to remember how to stand when cornered, to remember that silence is never neutral. She left behind no monument, only a reflex, that if someone crosses the line, someone else will step forward. And sometimes that alone is enough to shift an entire society.